to test out my new ring light here. 3, 2, 1. Oh my god. Hello friends, it's Dan. Welcome back. Welcome to another book review, this time for Modeling and Painting Science Fiction Miniatures by Crowwood Wargaming Guides, Crowwood Press, and written by Paul Stanley. So I want you to know right away, Paul Stanley sent this to me very kindly along with his Modeling and Painting Fantasy Figures book that we reviewed a little over a week ago. And if you did not watch this review, I don't always do this, but I do recommend you go watch that because I'm going to be doing a lot of comparisons to this guide. This one I think is quite foundational to this one. And so I will be actually probably bringing it in a couple of times just for some direct comparisons. But go give that one at least a skim just so you know what I'm talking about when I'm making references to this book. This is also a fantastic tome that I think everybody should have in their collection. I'm very excited for this because the first book, if you watched that review, you'll know was excellent, like exceptional. I said comprehensive, something that is going to be applicable for, of course, new wargamers because it walks through everything in detail, kind of in a natural progression of the information you would want to know. But also there were so many tips within it that even I, as somebody who's been wargaming for 25 plus years, was finding information like every other page. It would be like, oh my god, is that right? So I'm really excited to see how he built upon that kind of core concept with the fantasy guide with this science fiction guide. Paul Stanley, too, I want you to know, if you're not aware, he is a well-respected sculptor in the community and author, of course, of these two books. He has a YouTube channel I've been subscribed to for a while. He's a wonderful guy. I really recommend you go subscribe to his channel. If you like what we do here, he does a lot of what we do, but better in some cases because he's got a lot more experience and insights than I have. And he has a much, I think, larger and more impressive collection of miniatures to draw from for things like scale comparison. So I'll link down in the description. Go check out his channel as a favor to me. So this guide, from a layout standpoint, is very similar to the fantasy guide, which is great for having them on the shelf. The only criticism I have, this is not Paul Stanley's fault, but this is definitely the publisher. You can see here that the spine is different, like the layout of it. So again, that's just my OCD, seeing them side by side on a shelf. That I would almost want them to be like volume 1, volume 2, but of course, couldn't have known that there was going to be a 2 when the 1 was written. So that's a minor quibble in the scheme of things. It's 176 pages, which is exactly the same page count as the fantasy guide. That one was also 176 pages, again published by Crowwood Press, and published in 2021. The first book, the fantasy guide, was published in 2018, so about 3 years later on this one. You can see the binding is sewn, or maybe some combination of sewing and gluing. It's, I said, very robust. It doesn't feel like it's going to flake apart or anything like that. And Crowwood, I learned, actually has an extensive series of guides on things like building model aircraft, etc. So they're a well-respected publisher. So what I'm looking out for here, oh, and Paul did sign this again very kindly. I asked him to on both. So he has a nice little message there for me, which I greatly appreciate. So from a layout standpoint, this is where, again, I'll be leaning on, I think, the fantasy guide quite a bit. You can see from a progression standpoint, his approach here is that he wants it to be comprehensive, is the word I'm going to keep coming back to, but thorough enough that somebody who has no idea what we're talking about here can pick this book up, read it start to finish, and have a very good idea of how to build and paint a, in this case, sci-fi army for whatever game system that you want. So you can see that the natural progression here is we're starting through, after a forward introduction, we're going to go through tools and equipment. He's going to be talking about scales, how to build the miniatures, assembling them, and then basic painting techniques, and so forth. I really appreciate this kind of approach where it's going to be detailed enough for the new wargamer that they can use it as kind of like one-stop shopping for all of this information, but also as a kind of desk reference, as we talked about in the first guide, for those of us who are more experienced to like kind of flip through as we will. Another forward here by Rick Priestley, who wrote the forward to the fantasy guide as well. Rick Priestley, we learned in the first, of course, Rick Priestley is a huge name within wargaming and Games Workshop specifically. He wrote the very popular How to Paint Citadel Miniatures painting guide. And has another really lovely forward here, which is not copy and pasted. It's all new information here. and is all, I think, very truthful. He's a wonderful guy. I said in the first one that I hope someday I have somebody write something like that about me. Preface and acknowledgments here, as we saw with the first book as well. Paul's very considerate and giving shout outs to, again, a lot of big names within the community, kind of talking about how he came to start working on this book. Again, the acknowledgments section over here. One other thing I want you to pay attention to, and this is another reason why it would be worth looking at that first book review if you did not, is I want you to pay attention not only to the layout, which the flow is going to be quite similar, but there's only I think I counted 2 or 3 photos in here that are duplicated. And those are mostly in the tools section, which we'll get to, because it makes sense. I don't need a very different picture of brushes here, right? But especially once we're getting into the painting sections, you could imagine where the temptation might exist to just kind of reuse a bunch of photos, and that is absolutely not the case. The other thing I'd like you to pay attention to here, this is a nice introduction from Paul on how he got into wargaming, the things that interested him. This is much more specific to the sci-fi space, talking about kind of the shows and movies that interested him when he was younger, the game systems that kind of bridge the gap between these spaces. And the thing that struck me, and this becomes really evident, especially once we move into this tools section, is that none of this, and I mentioned none of the photos are copied and pasted, none of the text is lifted from the first book. And so that's something that I really want to ingrain in you as we're going throughout this review. If you're thinking to yourself, well, I already have the fantasy guide, what is there here for me? The answer is there's a lot. This is a totally new book. Again, the flow of it is similar to the first one, but this is a totally different book. So we're moving into tools and equipment here, and again, remember the layout here is it's laid out so that the new gamer can kind of pick this up and start reading through it chronologically and understand what we're talking about here. A slightly expanded section on color theory, which I appreciate. There was a little blurb in the first one that even admitted this is a huge topic, but giving you some idea of color theory as we're approaching this topic. Now, this is what I really want to point out. So this is a good side-by-side comparison that we can do here. So on the left, we've got the sci-fi guide. If I flip open to the exact same topic in the fantasy guide, let me just read the first sentence here just to prove a point. This is the section on brushes. Given the considerable difference in price between some brushes, many modelers may be reluctant to shop around in their search for one that will both deliver on quality and last a reasonable length of time. That's from the fantasy book. Here's the first sentence of brushes here. It is easy to forget that brushes are consumable items and that over time they will wear out. Now, are we talking about a similar concept here? Yes. Is this directly copied from this? No, it is totally rewritten from the ground up. Same thing with detailing brushes, right, where we're talking about the need for detailed work being an important investment. It's important to, right, it's possible to economize by using cheap oil brushes for basic painting tasks. It's a different book, guys. So yes, it's going to be covering similar information because a lot of this is going to be relevant to sci-fi gamers as it is to fantasy gamers. But this is a totally different book. And I think the argument that I'm going to be making throughout this one is that if you already have the fantasy guide and you're only a fantasy player, that's good. That's absolutely going to be a great thing to have in your collection. But if you are a rounded gamer, right, who plays some sci-fi systems, mass battles, skirmish, fantasy, historical, what have you, there's a really good, compelling case to have both of these books because you're going to have information in here that's not in the fantasy book, right? And the read, as we just saw, while it's going to cover similar information because he's making similar points, especially as we go through the tools, right? It's not the exact same book. It's not the exact same read. So again, very comprehensive take here on all the different options. We're going to get at the end to the fact that there's also an index, which makes for very easy reference to all of this subject matter here. There's a couple of things that were actually added in this section here that I didn't see in the fantasy guide. So again, maybe just things that occurred to him after the fantasy guide was written or things that he expanded his experience with in the 3 years between the publication of those two books. But this is all great. Again, I keep saying that this is going to be great for a new gamer who has no idea what a pin vise and a drill is, but also great for the experienced gamer who maybe has been painting for a long time but has never dealt with, a pin vise, doesn't know how to pin miniatures. So you could very quickly flip to this page and get information on I didn't mention either that the layout here is very similar to what we saw in the fantasy guide, that there's a footer here that tells you at a glance what chapter you're in, which I greatly appreciate, even just as a reference, right, to be able to flip open to any given section and know exactly where you're at. You can always see at the bottom here we've moved into sci-fi miniatures and popular scales. There's that section down here. So this is one change I think that happened between the two editions, where there was a section in the first book on choosing your miniatures, then the section on tools, and then the section on kind of a fantasy model overview, and then talking about scale. Those two sections, the chapter 1 and 3 in the first book, are kind of condensed here into one, which I think makes way more sense than going from high-level overview of fantasy concepts into tools, then back into fantasy miniatures. It works either way, but I think that this, from a flow standpoint for a new gamer, makes more sense here. Talking about different materials here. Again, as with the first book, we're going to see kind of a cursory overview of things like hard plastic that he then expands on once we move into the how to assemble your miniatures section. Again, a nice topic here on scales. Wonderful little reference chart here, which, as I said, I almost want to photocopy and put up on my work desk here because it's just so handy to have. And we see a similar expansion of a theme in this book here, because he draws on so much of his own anecdotes and experience throughout this that I mentioned in the first book. Almost makes this almost like a little history of wargaming, because we see topics about different manufacturers, changes to scales over time. We're talking about that here, where he's talking about the usefulness of different scales, what kind of game systems they would be applicable in, why different scales are better than others for different circumstances. And as a result, it feels kind of like a mini history lesson in wargaming. As I said, I would love to see him write a book on the history of wargaming. I think he would do an exceptional job. So here, as we saw with the first book, we're moving into his section on assembling and converting miniatures. So this is where he does a more deep dive on the different material types, how to assemble them. A nice extensive section here on plastic, which I love, about how to snip things from sprue. Again, I'm going to be repeating myself a little bit with the fantasy guide, because I'm as impressed with this book as I am the first. But again, things like this, where he doesn't even assume that you know how to snip something off of a sprue. I think that that's something that often gets lost, especially in the YouTube space, right, where we're trying to teach, various topics, instruct on various topics, and as experts, it's very easy for us to get caught up in details, kind of forest for the trees sort of problem, where we miss out on some obvious stuff, things that we take for granted from a knowledge standpoint. And you can see just how comprehensive this book is, going through step by step. You can see there's multiple instances once we move into this section on, especially in the painting section, where he's giving you kind of a progression of here's step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And I really appreciate that too. Right, here's a section on how to bend resin back just from heating it up. But this, as a reference guide for you as a gamer, is really handy to have. One, because it's tangible and permanent, right? So even if your power is out, you'll be able to pull this off the shelf and read. You can take it camping with you, whatever you want. So I like the physicality of that, especially in a world where questions in a digital space on ownership are becoming a little bit more muddled. But also, it's much easier to reference things like this, right? How to bend things back in printed, written format than it is in video format. And I'm speaking as a YouTuber who puts out videos, that there's a lot of concepts within this hobby that are just better to reference like this, where you can see step by step what it is, rather than having to speed up, slow down, stop, or skip through a video in order to get information. Note too the quality of all the pictures, right? They're very highly detailed. They're all full color, right? Which aids, especially as we move into the painting section, of course, as you can imagine, in understanding what it is that we're doing. The layout is also exceptional. There's nothing that crosses the gutter in the book. This is owing to Crow would just do a wonderful job with layout, with the book design. But it leads to such a professional presentation. I mean, just take a moment here to take in this series of pages here, which I said in combination with Paul's really exceptional writing, makes for a wonderful read, because here you can see it's almost like you're just overwhelmed with information between all the pictures, all the annotations there explaining what's going on, giving information. Paul has a nice professional writing style all throughout. I mentioned in the first review that he uses terms like this author instead of I, which gives it a very professional feel throughout, makes it feel like you're in good hands, someone who's quite knowledgeable, and he is. Little sections on gap filling. This is something you'll hear me repeat maybe multiple times in this review, that one thing I hope Paul eventually does is a full guide on sculpting, because he almost teases us with it a few times. His skill as a sculptor is really incredible. Section here on converting miniatures, which is very easy to do with plastics. You know, it's a big reason why I'm such a fan of plastics. And here, I mean, note the number of photos within this too. I think it's actually more than the fantasy guide. We're talking hundreds of photos throughout this here. Again, now we're building on the multiple things we've learned, right? We're talking about converting a miniature using a little bit of gap filling here as part of your conversion. You can see how, if you're reading through this just page by page, it builds on itself as you go. One other advantage to this guide, or this series of guides, is that you can see we're drawing from a lot of different manufacturers throughout, which is in stark contrast to, again, say the How to Paint Citadel Miniatures guide, which is great if you like Citadel miniatures, especially of that era, but limiting because, you know, it only gives you an idea of those models. Whereas here, I think again, in the acknowledgement section in the back, it talks about something like 30 different manufacturers that provided miniatures and accessories for this guide, which is really phenomenal to even just have access to that all throughout. This is a little section that we also saw in the fantasy guide on mold lines, vents, flashing. That's actually expanded. This is a 2-page section that is explaining not just how to clean them, but providing information on where they come from. Again, going back to this being somewhat of a history of wargaming, in addition to it being a practical guide. So here, once again, talking about priming miniatures, how to clean them, prepare them, different substances, like materials, how you want to use different primers for them, because like Reaper Bones, it's going to be sticky if you spray paint, explaining why that's the case. So really just going into super thorough detail, which is, as I keep repeating, it's going to be practical information for the new gamer who has no idea about any of this, but also practical for us. That's what I've learned throughout this experience within the hobby, is that not only are there different facets of the hobby, there's organizing and collecting miniatures, there's painting miniatures, there's writing army lists, there is just even building the miniatures separate from the painting of the miniatures is like a hobby in and of itself, converting, right? And within each of those substrates, there are different ways to do it, right? There's dozens of ways to paint your miniatures, dozens of ways to base your miniatures, dozens of game systems that you can play and write lists for. So that's more my point here, is that as we go through, this is talking about like Zenith, right? Zenithal priming, right? That you might have somebody who's been in the hobby for 20 years that doesn't know what Zenithal priming is, because we become experts in whatever substrate we're used to doing. It's just kind of like what we do, and that's what we've always done. So until we see or experience something different, we don't even know what we don't know, right? So the basic painting technique section is great, and again, builds on the fantasy techniques, touching on some of the same topics, expanding on them in some cases as well. Again, this is where I really want you to pay attention to the fact that there are no duplicated pictures between these books. To my eye, I've only caught like I think 2 or 3 so far, and they were talking about tools. There was like the mold line section, the paintbrush section on tools. It's stuff that is meant to be kind of like generic information, but the miniatures themselves, you can see, are different. This is a great example of when I'm talking about painting progression, how it moves through in a gradual way. The other thing that I'll repeat here that I think is important is that I really respect the fact that Paul didn't outsource the painting section to anybody else. We see that in other painting guides where you've got an author that is describing what's happening, and then like professional painters that are doing the painting work. Paul's a great painter in his own right, but the thing I really admire about that, especially if we go back to like this section here, right, is that this is done in such a way that I read this, and I'm an amateur painter right at best, and I feel I could do this. And I think that's very important for a guide that can be used by either an experienced painter or a new painter, right? Somebody who's never painted anything in their life before needs to be able to pick up a guide like this and think I could do that. Because while it's great to have like a pro painted my here, it's the same thing. We're talking about progressions, and this is over multiple pages, talking about just like picking out teeth, right? How do you do a progression on that to end up with something like this? And that's really wonderful. But the goal of this book is not to sell miniatures. I said it's to sell ideas and techniques, and in order to do that, it needs to be approachable. Like even this here, like this is a great example of what I'm talking about when I talk about me as an experienced gamer who can learn stuff from this. He has Santa with white beard and with the white fur around his cloak, right? And you see what he's base coated over here? Now, this is where it gets interesting, because for some of you looking at this, this is obvious. You've done this before. But for me, I've never considered that, like, I know that there's like a warm and a cool tone to painting white, but I've never in a million years would have thought, let me base coat purple and like an off yellow to then progress up to white, as he's done here. And you can see how wonderful this is, the contrast between those two. And again, it's information that I never would have known, right? But for a guide like this. So that's, again, I keep coming back to that even if you've been in the hobby for a long time, there's going to be, I promise, something for you, maybe on every page, but certainly within every chapter, there's going to be information in here that is valuable to you. And this is going to be a nice desk reference that you can come back to time and again. So this is a chapter on how to build on the basic painting techniques that were talked about in the first chapter, even in some cases coming back to some of the previous miniatures that we had been talking about and building on them here, which I think is another very clever idea. Same thing here, like this orc that we painted the teeth on. Now let's paint his coat, right? And once again, just pay attention to the sheer volume of photos that are here. This book does a really good job too. I'd mentioned, like, in an ideal world, he wouldn't have to, like, it's extra work for him to have to spell out where all these miniatures are coming from. But you can see here, like, wherever he has miniatures, he has it usually listed down in the bottom where they're coming from. I had said in the last review that it would be cool if, like, there was like a maybe Roman numeral system that was then tied to various manufacturers in the back. The same thing here, you can see. You can figure out where they're from just from looking down at the reference beneath the photo. Now we're moving into a section on weathering. This is a key difference between the fantasy guides as we move into weathering, as we move into vehicles. That's where they're going to start to diverge in terms of subject matter. You can see there's different techniques for weathering, right? Salt chipping, just using like watered down paint to build up, pigments, right, glow effects, which wouldn't have been as relevant in the fantasy guide. We're now talking about here, right, plasma weapons, glow effects. Right, but all presented in such a way that I feel I could do as an amateur painter, and I think somebody who's brand new to wargaming could look at it and think, yeah, I could do something like that. It's inspirational that way. Section on alien creatures. Here we saw there was a section in the fantasy guide on like ghosts, like monsters. So it makes sense to have this as kind of the counterpart to that. Going through how to paint like kind of decaying flesh, ghostly forms. And again, sticking with these progressions that really remind me of like White Dwarf painting articles. Or at least what White Dwarf painting articles used to be. Another example of where this becomes useful as a desk reference, not even in just talking about general techniques, but because each section of the painting area has like these subsections. So say you're painting something for right, a skirmish game, right, that involves some kind of ghost and you need to paint ectoplasm, and you think, I don't even know where to start with ectoplasm. You can see how having a reference like this that you can then source in an index, oh, here's a section on ectoplasm, right, let me read up on how to paint ectoplasm. And this is not presented in a like hard and fast way either. This is a guide, right? These are recommendations. This is what Paul does. He throws a lot of that in throughout the book too. Like he'll say like this author uses this material, or this author uses this tool, or this author recommends this, right? But that's all this is. This is him providing his experience and insight in order to give you ideas that you could then either use directly, adapt for yourself, blend with some other techniques that you might have, or as I said, even like blend in with some information that you get from some of the YouTube videos that you watch. Where other authors are involved, Paul also does an excellent job of citing that. You can see down here at the bottom, this is Rick Priestley, he painted these. So he's a real gentleman that way, that it doesn't involve any like cross-referencing to try to figure out who painted what. And here we see, this is also cool that we've seen this Reaper worm, like sandworm, I can't remember what it's called. But we've kind of seen this come back in all chapters and how he's been slowly building this up to make a real gruesome looking creature here. Section here on basing that we're now moving into, which we saw in the fantasy guide as well, but there's some new information presented here. Again, some restated information, some expanded information, but it gives you a very good like template to build on. There's more on like rubble, as you would imagine, for sci-fi basing versus fantasy basing. Right, dry brushing, gravel, things of that nature. Some different examples of different colors using the same technique. Right, here's what we're talking about when we talk about like rubble on scenic bases, which would be more applicable in a sci-fi setting. Again, another good reason why having both guides, if you're in a position to afford them, is incredibly useful, because it's not duplicated information, or there is some overlap in terms of information, but there is enough distinct information in both books that it's well worth having both. Right, discussion here on flight stands, again, not as relevant in fantasy. So here we're in this whole new section that does not exist in the fantasy guide, which is vehicles. So you can imagine that's a big point of distinction between fantasy and sci-fi ranges. And this even breaks down like how do you approach a large kit like this versus putting together a 4-part infantryman. Right, that's a very different process if you're talking about a 50-part vehicle that needs to go together in a certain way. So he kind of handholds you through that, walks you through it, and explains how he would put together a vehicle like this one. And once again, I can't stress enough that him leaning on so much of his personal experience and anecdotes is really refreshing throughout. Especially if you're, again, imagine the perspective of a brand new gamer, right, who would look at something like this and wonder, where do I even start? Right, it's very reassuring the way that he words things throughout that makes it feel, again, achievable, approachable. There's even a subsection here on complex assembly, like when you have to rubber band stuff together, hold stuff together with a pin vise, or if you would have to like paint something in sections and then assemble, and how you would approach that. So again, no stone unturned, right? That's really the takeaway from both of these guides. Even if it's only in a cursory way, I really do feel like he does touch on like every topic relevant to the collection and assembly and painting of, in this case, sci-fi miniatures. So this is a section then on painting those vehicles. I mentioned the assembly of a vehicle is, of course, quite different from the assembly of a smaller infantry model. This is talking about how you would paint them differently. Right, there's slightly different techniques. Of course, there's going to be a section at the end on weathering, but even thinking about painting in sections, and then assembling the model versus putting it all together and then painting, which makes it incredibly useful. Differences on highlighting and dry brushing techniques, inking techniques using like oils, etc., versus edge highlighting, stuff like that. How to do camo patterns on your vehicles, right? Cool little section here on cloaking devices, which I think looks fantastic. But even if you didn't, like, you can see how you could take the core concepts of what he's talking about, because this is foundational. Whether you're going to blend this out more or use different colors, that's the point, is that he's providing information for you to then utilize however you want, like mud to go into tires, stuff like that. This is where, again, his real extensive experience comes through. Where like if I painted up something like this, I wouldn't even think to do that, right? So it's just cool seeing somebody who has such extensive experience and knowledge sharing that throughout a book like this. It's really inspiring. It makes me want to go out and pick up a vehicle kit and throw some mud into the tires. Section here on lenses. Great choice of color too, all throughout, where it's not like he's painting the same colors over and over again. That's something that I picked up on the fantasy guide as well, that he has a real great eye for palettes, and even for us as the reader to keeping things visually interesting. Here then I had mentioned that once you're painted, there's a whole section on weathering. Right, look at that. Which is also useful. I keep talking about this, guys, that is useful to have both. Even if you're a fantasy gamer, like these techniques, this is basically what I do for like weathering shields, right? So this is all super relevant information for you as a wargamer, or if you're painting like a large centerpiece model for your fantasy army, right? There might be some like plate or armor components like this where you could utilize some of these techniques, right? So this is a sci-fi guide, of course, but as I said in the fantasy guide, being useful for historical gamers, this is absolutely useful for fantasy gamers. It's useful for historical gamers of even ancient conflict, but like modern conflicts, right? So there's so much you can do here. A section on water transfers, which I don't think was in the fantasy guide either, which is very useful. Because water, I remember my first experience with water slide transfers, and it was just like making it up as I went. So having a comprehensive look at how to do that is fantastic. This fun little section here at the end on mutating vehicles, right, which is, we're talking about like converting miniatures up at the earlier chapter. This is sort of a similar concept, but for vehicles. This is where he starts to expand on his real extensive sculpting abilities, which is cool to see. And there you have it. So little supplemental acknowledgments section here of all the supporting miniature companies, which are all ones that you should check out. Bibliography, suggested reading section here at the end, which mirrors what we saw in the fantasy guide. And I love an index, because what this means is it's alphabetized list of terms. So if you have something like enamel paint, right, maybe I'm dealing with enamel paint for the first time, you can see at a glance, oh, I just gotta go to page 19. It's gonna give me information on enamel paint. Oh, maybe I'm painting teeth, right? Page 78 to 81 is going to talk about that. So it makes it incredibly handy as a desk reference. So what's the final verdict? It's fantastic. It has all of the same strengths as the fantasy guide, but it builds on it and expands on some of those sections there too. You can almost see, like when I was reading through it, I was thinking where those sections are expanded, that like Paul had 3 years to think about the fantasy guide that he wrote, and like maybe he had some more anecdotes or insights that he wanted to share, and you see those come through here. There's also sections in here that don't exist in the fantasy guide, just as there's sections in the fantasy guide that don't exist here. So if you have the means, my strong recommendation is to get both, because I think that they complement each other so nicely. I'm going to repeat myself a little bit here on the fantasy guide too, but again, there is such a use for physical guides like this, even in a world where there's so much information available online. Not only because of kind of the philosophical arguments about whether that information online is always going to be there or if it's always going to be accessible to you, but more practically, right, it is so much easier with many of these concepts to be able to flip through and come back and reference a section that is still images and written text on a topic, rather than having to not only find whatever YouTube video you want on subject matter, but to have to then like skim through it and find the exact section that you want to go to. So anyway, as we approach the holiday season here, really I would strongly recommend you think about this, certainly for yourself. I think I said in the fantasy guide section that if you're the kind of person who's like reticent to tell your friends and family members about miniatures that you might want, even just out of fear that they might pick up the wrong ones, this is a great kind of way to get around that, if it's still something hobby related. But as I also said, like, maybe a little bit classier, right, to ask for a book instead of a box of miniatures from a family member. But also a great option to give to a friend who's a wargamer. If you're a family member who doesn't wargame and you stumbled on this video, this is an excellent thing to give somebody who's into wargaming, or like one of your club mates, something like that. I think the price point is perfect for a gift. So check it out. I'll have a link down in the description to the Crowwood Press. If you are in the US or Canada, they don't ship to the US or Canada, but I'll have a link to Amazon where you can pick it up there as well. Massive thanks once again to Paul Stanley, another fantastic book. I'll be badgering him for years now on the fact that I want to see a sculpting guide from him. I want to see a terrain guide from him, and I would really love to see like a little history of wargaming guide from him. So maybe we can all encourage him. Again, check out his YouTube channel as well, link in the description to that also. Massive thanks to you for dropping by for this one in the meantime, and until next time, happy gaming.